So we should probably begin because we're a bit past Berkeley time. Hello, everybody. I'm Misha Lerner. I'm a fifth year in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and also I'm a member of the Jewish Studies DE. I study Russian Jewish literature and Yiddish, and today I really have the honor of introducing and talking to our guest, Sam Sussman. I'll read his biography, and also our mutual friend who unfortunately couldn't make it had a couple of words he wanted me to read, so I'll read that as well. Sam Sussman is the author of the USA Today bestselling novel Boy from the North Country, a finalist for the National Jewish Book Awards in fiction. Sussman holds a BA from Swarthmore College and an MPhil from Oxford, where he wrote a dissertation on Rousseau. He has lived in Berlin and Jerusalem and taught writing and literature in the UK, India, and Chile. He has written for Harper's, The Washington Post, and has been profiled in the New York Times. Boy from the North Country is published by Penguin Press in the US and Grove Press in the UK and is forthcoming in German, Spanish, and Hebrew. And this is what Danny would have said if he was here. Because this is a lecture on Jewish American literature, I feel that one must riff the opening lines of Augie March. Sam Sussman is an American, New York born, and he goes about things as he taught himself, freestyle. First to knock, first to be admitted. Like Augie March, Sam and I have roamed around. We have nearly gotten stranded in Nice and then gotten in a fight with a surly bus driver. We have sung Phil Oak songs together at his home in the Hudson Valley. We have agonized over our loves and losses. Boy from the North Country is the fruit of a decade of constant, unrelenting effort. It is a well-deserved consecration. Sam's commitment to literature and the kinds I care about, French, Jewish, American, is as old as our friendship. And what makes me so proud of him is how persistent and unyielding he has been. He weathered years of rejections and false starts before this all came together. I'm honored to call him a close friend, and I'm a bit verklempt to see him finally receive the recognition he deserves. Dear Sam, I am so proud of you. And lastly, I should mention that after the event, Sam will be selling copies of his book, Boy from the North Country, which you should all purchase. Sam was a bit disappointed that we had to turn this event into a crass commercial affair, but I'll remind him that without Mendele Macher's Forum, without Mendele the Book Peddler, we wouldn't have you, this book, or Jewish literature to begin with. So you should really embrace the tradition. Without further ado, I give you the mic.
Well, that was one of the best introductions I have been lucky enough to receive in many, many events the last 6 months. So, Misha, thank you. Danny, if he was here, I would thank him. Very touching words. There's only one factual correction there, which is that one of us got into a fight with a French bus driver, and you can guess who that might have been. But in all seriousness, it's an honor to be here. Misha, Etta, thank you very much for having me here at the Center for Jewish Studies. I'm going to say a few words about the Jewish novel, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then what I'm really excited for is just let's open it up to questions, and that's always excellent. So, all right, I have about maybe a 20-minute lecture, something like that. All right. So what is the Jewish novel? This is an extraordinary question because it asks as a preliminary that we define two undefinable terms, Jewish and novel. If we ask what is the American Jewish novel, our impossible dyad becomes an impossible triad. Academics, in my experience, tend to be like the wise son. They ask, as objectively as they can, what are the laws? How do things work? But novelists are like the wicked son. We ask in a selfish inversion, what does this mean to me? So, true to my trade, I will limit myself to the question as I have tried to make sense of it in my life as a writer. And I would formulate that question like this. What does it mean to write within the Jewish literary tradition in our day when the four canonical Jewish stories of the last century, assimilation, faith, the Shoah, and Zionism, have been falsified by retelling? When the sociological material of contemporary Jewish life has been written and rewritten into such deep familiarity, what deeper spiritual and aesthetic resources does Judaism offer, even insist on offering, the novelist? The youngest son of Shalom Aleichem was a painter named Norman Rabin, who taught for decades in a studio on the 11th floor of Carnegie Hall. While teaching a painting class midway through Boy from the North Country, Rabin tells his students, "Only paint if it is holy. This is what Hasidim understands. Your painting must be a prayer to life. Your painting must be a way of life." For Rabin, painting as a way of life meant seeing the divinity within each person. He began each day in his studio by describing what he had observed on his walk from his apartment near Central Park West and 100th Street to Carnegie Hall, about a 35-minute walk. The expression on a squirrel's face as it fled a bicycle, shadow and light on lovers' clasped hands, sweat on a jogger's throat. He described the feelings and memories each observation evoked within him before he began to paint. He believed that any moment could contain artistic and spiritual insight. To paint was to commit oneself to seeing the world through the lens of this possibility, to observing its divinity. Rabin understood himself as belonging to an artistic tradition that reached back to the stories of the Torah. Once, in a perhaps apocryphal tale, he found himself frustrated by the shortcomings of a student and, knocking her canvas off her easel, told her, "If you want even the slightest chance of ever creating anything worthwhile, you must start at the very beginning." He gave her a Torah and told her to sit on the floor and begin to read. This was not mere rhetoric for Rabin. Here is the Rabin of Boy from the North Country, linking Torah literature to the aesthetics of the Chagall painting Joseph, a Shepherd, which you can observe behind me. Let Chagall, this is Rabin, let Chagall's sensual blue welcome you into the painting. Let yourself become a child looking into the sky. You are looking at Joseph from Genesis, shortly before he is sold into slavery by his brothers. Look at the olive hills and his ivory skin. Do you feel Joseph's innocence? For those of you who are illiterate, Chagall has also put these emotions in Joseph's expression and posture. We are seduced into color by this painting, but once he has your attention, Chagall tells a story that none of you expect. Do you notice that Joseph is the spitting image of Chagall? You know the story of Joseph. He's sold into slavery by his brothers, then rises to power in Egypt by interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams. Famine comes to Canaan, Joseph's brothers journey to Egypt. There they are terrified to learn that Joseph wields great power. But rather than punish his brothers, Joseph gives them the most fertile terrain in all of Egypt, the land of Goshen. There the Hebrew people thrive. Goshen is paradise divine. The Hebrew population grows until the Egyptians become envious and fearful and force the Hebrews into slavery. This is the greatest turning point in Jewish history. For if the Hebrews had been left to flourish in Goshen, if they had not been enslaved, there would have been no Exodus, no parting of the Red Sea, no revelation at Sinai, no land of milk and honey, and no Jerusalem. Joseph lives to see none of this. He dies a rich and powerful man in the land of Egypt. Yet on his deathbed, he asks that his bones be buried in the home to which he never returned, Canaan. Moshe Chagall grew up in a shtetl in the tundra in what's now Belarus. At the age Joseph traveled to Egypt, Chagall travels to Paris. There, Moishe Chagall transforms himself into Marc Chagall. How? By interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams with color and canvas. Chagall wins this future by painting his past, the huts and dancing fiddlers and bearded Hasidic men of Vitebsk, the childhood home he lost as Joseph lost Canaan. His style carries him into Parisian modernism, while his subject bears him back into the Jewish past. With this self-portrait, Chagall reclaims his origins. He is saying, I am not only the acclaimed artist, but also the shepherd Joseph. I have come a long way from home, yet I would still allow the sheep of that shtetl to put their noses you know where. This is only one interpretation. What is important is not that my ideas are right. What is important is that I can interpret this idea through Chagall's use of color. Do not try to paint something that allows only one interpretation. Then you will become a true illiterate. Any art must resist simplistic understanding. Anything worthwhile, that is. I'm not talking about soup cans. Genuine art is a failure. But why is Chagall's Joseph a Shepherd so successful a failure? Because of color. If there was only metaphor between Chagall and Joseph, this would be a soup can. Now enough talking. Everyone go back to failing. And this time, please fail in color rather than in black and white. June Klausner, a young woman in Rabin's class, describes this lecture 40 years later to her son, Evan. June raises Evan far from conventional Jewish life. They live in the woods outside a town in upstate New York called Goshen. They have no affiliation with other Jews. The only nearby Jewish community is Kiryas Yoel, a village of 30,000 Satmar. As a teenager, Evan reflects, we had never gone to synagogue. I hadn't had a bar mitzvah. I hadn't yet discovered that 20th century American literature had been significantly influenced by Jewish writers. I wasn't even circumcised. I will also tell on Evan by adding that his stepfather is a born-again evangelical Christian. But June lives within a deep spirituality at a Rabin-like meeting point of Jewish mysticism and artistic creation. Hasidic men wander spectral-like through the rural landscape near Goshen. When he is a child, the clothing of these Hasidic men reminds Evan of the costumes of a play, and he asks his mother, are they actors? In a way, June says, but they believe in these roles with all their heart, and their only audience is God. This link between divinity, artistic expression, and the observation of the quotidian is essential to June's understanding of Judaism. When Evan is in his mid-20s, he returns home to Goshen from London to help June through chemotherapy. One night they smoke her medical marijuana, and she explains the theological lineage between the Baal Shem Tov, Martin Buber, and her 9-pound rat terrier, Lucy, who bears an uncanny resemblance to the goat in Chagall's Joseph, a shepherd. She says, Buber was committed to the idea first expressed by the Baal Shem Tov, that divinity is in every moment. In the time of the Baal Shem Tov, Jewish knowledge was hoarded by the rabbinical class. He was a theological democrat. He believed ordinary people have access to the divine through every moment of our lives. Buber thinks Hasidism has forgotten this. Hasidism tries to find divinity in the preordained, ritual, prayer, clothing. Buber doesn't think that's how God works. God is in this world rather than outside this world. Every blade of grass is holy. In a way, he's more Hasidic than the Hasidim. So is Lucy. Every moment is joyful for her. A snuggle, a romp, a good meal outside, a good meal. The same squeaky toy thrown the same way is always an adventure. We walk the same trail in the woods 3 or 4 times a day, and for Lucy it never has less than infinite potential. Every smell is divine. Life is magical because she sees it that way. I have never met anyone who finds more divinity in every moment of my life. Lucy is my Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote that Judaism is a religion of time rather than of space. One of the questions through which we must perceive Evan's situation is, what does it mean to experience Jewish consciousness beyond and after the familiar spaces of Jewish life? We might even push this question further by asking, what does it mean to receive Judaism without Jews? This question might interest anyone concerned with the narrative that Jewish continuity is threatened by assimilation, intermarriage, loss of faith, and the dissolution of political consensus. June is offering her son a Judaism that exists not in synagogues or communal institutions, but rather the divinity of all things. Here she is describing a tree. Sometimes I am overwhelmed by how much I love that maple tree. It's given me so much. Blossoms in spring, shade in summer, foliage in autumn, syrup in winter. I've wondered if I'm mad to love this tree so deeply. Then I remind myself, the question isn't how much can you love a tree? The question is, how much can you love? How much can you open yourself to the glory of life, the way it's always changing, always giving, the way life breaks and mends your heart? I am, speaking biographically, an unusual figure to say anything about the Jewish novel. Like Evan, I was not raised within conventional Jewish community. I do not speak or read Hebrew, Yiddish, or Ladino. I am not circumcised. I did not have a bar mitzvah. Judaism for me lies not in religious faith, nor the Rothian suburbs of New Jersey. And arguably, the aesthetic form that most shapes Boy from the North Country is Christian, the Madonna and Child. So I am reminded here of the story told by Gershom Schramm in his opus, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. When the Baal Shem had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, and meditate in prayer. And what he had set out to perform was done. When a generation later, the Maggid of Meseritz was faced with the same task, he would go to the same place and say, we can no longer light the fire, but we can still speak the prayers. And what he wanted done became reality. Again, a generation later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sosov had to perform this task. And he too went into the woods and said, we can no longer light a fire, nor do we know the secret meditations belonging to the prayer. But we do know the place in the woods where it all belongs. That must be sufficient, and sufficient it was. But when another generation had passed, and Rabbi Israel of Rishon was called upon to perform the task, he sat down on his golden chair in his castle, and he said, we cannot light the fire, we cannot speak the prayers, we do not know the place, but we can tell the story of how it was done. And the storyteller adds, the story which he had told had the same effect as the actions of the prior three. The Jewish novel, like Judaism itself, is a refashioning, a retelling, an act of myth-making. That is the origin and the power of Torah, and it remains the promise of Jewish literature. I'm certain that I have offered more than one perplexing idea, so let me close with a clarifying story my mother once told me, and that June tells Evan in Boy from the North Country. Once, she said, a young woman unsure of her place in the world begins to wander the land. She speaks to old people and young people, rich people and poor people, happy people and unhappy people. She takes pleasure in listening to the story of each life. One day, this woman meets another wandering woman. The second woman says she is listening to the story of each person she meets because she herself is the Mashiach, the Holy One. The first woman walks ahead, distrustful of anyone who would think of herself in such grandiose terms. She hopes not to see this second woman again. But that night, the two women rest at the same inn. The first woman watches the second woman speak to an elderly man. She hears the same questions that she asks. She sees the same smiles and laughs. She realizes the man does not know which of the women believes she is the Mashiach and which is merely a wandering woman. Both are lost. Both are trying to make sense of the world's infinite complexities. With this realization, the first woman approaches the second. They share their stories, they embrace, they journey on together. "Mom," I said. "Evan," she replied, "I don't understand the story." "I know," she said, "but one day I hope you will." Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your talk. It's very nice that you say that academics are the wise son. Oftentimes, I feel like I'm the Chenelier le Shoal, my own research, but regardless, the Chenelier le Shoal is the one who doesn't know how to ask. But regardless, I find it interesting that in your presentation, in which you try to grapple with some of this novel's most Jewish elements, you focus on Norman Rabin, who is one of the major artistic personalities of this book. And I would say that really, in my reading of the book, all of the major artistic personalities are Jewish. There's, of course, Evan, June, Norman Rabin, as I mentioned, Stella Adler, and Bob Dylan. And I was wondering, if you had them here in the room, what do you think they would say about this book, Boy from the North Country? Because they all have incredibly interesting things to say about art, literature, and I feel like everything they have to say about art and literature is itself a comment on the book. And maybe before you launch into that question, if you could summarize for the audience briefly what the book is about.
Okay. Great, okay. Well, sure. The basic outline of the story is mother-son story. June raises Evan in Goshen, upstate New York. She's had this prior life in sort of bohemian New York Jewish arts world in the 1970s, and she's left that behind and has created this sort of very idyllic, remote life in the woods. And it's just the two of them. They have a very close relationship when Evan is growing up. And the one sort of unspoken feature of their relationship is that Evan doesn't know the identity of his biological father. And when he's a teenager, first the teacher, then other people in his life sort of mention to him, you look a bit like this artist, musician, Bob Dylan. Do you know anything about him? Evan starts listening to the music, is interested in it, and to make a long story short, he, one day they're in the car, he's in the car with his stepfather, a Dylan song comes on, and the stepfather says, there's a line in there about your mother. And Evan is a bit jarred by this. He's sort of shocked by the idea that his mother would know Dylan. He tries to talk to her about it. She doesn't want to talk about it. Giving the brief version, first she says, no, I never knew him. Then she says, okay, yes, I did know him, but, yes, we had a relationship. This is a long time before you were born. And then she says, okay, we met a long time before you were born, and our relationship continued until the year before you were born, but she won't say anything more. So Evan leaves home and, with these aspirations to become a writer on his own terms, and he lives abroad, and the novel opens when he's in his mid-20s and he comes home because June is sick. They're spending week after week with each other. It's the most time they're spending together in his adult life. And for the first time, she starts opening up about this earlier period of her life that she's never spoken about. And so a third of the novel is sort of her recreation of this 1970s New York art world where the artists who Misha's describing appear. And, Evan sort of feels that for the first time, his mother is bringing him toward Dylan, sharing more. She's describing their relationship. It's a very intimate account of him. And then, of course, as the novel moves on, the realization that Evan is coming to is that this search for a father is really leading him closer to his mother. That what he's really coming into is a deeper understanding of who is this woman who raised him and why has she made these choices in her life to take him to this place in the woods and to have this very sort of idyllic and somewhat sheltered life. And it's really at its heart a mother-son love story, and it's about how they each come to understand each other more deeply in what turns out to be the end of her life. And it's really about, what a parent who knows that their time is limited chooses to give to their child, knowing that their child's life will continue and theirs will not. So it is also very much, as Misha says, sort of a novel about what it means to transform our lives into art. And Evan is trying to write a novel, and when he comes home, this has been the project of his young adult life, and he hasn't been very successful. He says when he first comes home, I've never known how to tell my own story, not even to myself. And one of the things he's realizing as the novel goes along is that he's sort of conceived of literature as this purely cerebral project, right? He's gone off, he's had this wonderful education, he's studied literature, but the reason he hasn't been able to write is that he hasn't yet begun to draw on his mother's wisdom. His work has lacked any moral or spiritual dimension. And then June, in the earlier part of her life that we go back to, she's this young woman trying to understand, make sense of very difficult life experiences, and she's doing that by playing Hedda Gabler in the underground theater world. And at the moment that her relationship with Dylan begins, he's in this personal and artistic crisis. It's 1974. He feels he hasn't written anything worthwhile since Blonde on Blonde, and we see him as he's sort of struggling through this personal and artistic crisis to write the songs that become Blood on the Tracks. And then the two figures of the generation older than them are Rabin and Adler, and June and Dylan meet in Rabin's painting class, so we spend a lot of time in that studio with Rabin sort of giving lecture after lecture, as you got a taste on, of his sort of various aesthetic theories. And Adler is sort of a major figure as well. They were friends, and it's through Adler that June has ended up in Rabin's class, and we spend a lot of time in Stella Adler's acting studio and get a sense also. Her and Rabin have, in some ways, fairly antithetical notions of the relationship between self and art, which we can get to. Okay, so it's a long overview. Now, what would these artists make of the book? Well, okay, that's a fantastic question. I've never been asked that before, so I'm happy for the chance to think about it. So Stella Adler, I hope she would be fascinated by the parallels between method acting and autofiction. So, of course, for those familiar with Stella Adler, right, her whole theory is, when you when you act a role, right, you have to forget your experiences. You have to become that other, that character, right? And she yells at June extensively when June admits that she's drawing on her own experience to make sense of Hedda Gabler or other characters. And Stella says to her, acting is not about you. You're 20 years old. You haven't had any interesting life experiences. You have to imagine yourself into someone else's situation. Don't draw on your narrow sliver of life experience. And I thought a lot, right, so the novel is sort of significantly autobiographical, and the third, drawn from my mother's life, is really heavily drawn from her life. So I'm sitting there at the desk every day, sort of imagining myself into my mother's subjectivity, right? And my mom had talked a lot about her life in that period, but when someone tells you their life, tells a story, they give you the broad strokes. They don't give you every novelistic detail, right? So there was an act of imagination, right? There's an act of sort of inhabiting that subjectivity, which to me was, personally very profound, to sit within the perspective of this 20-year-old woman who went on to be my mother. So I thought a great deal about Stella Adler in that period and what it means to inhabit this role, and to what extent did I actually want to discard my sense of self and sort of sit humbly within this artistic task and just imagine this woman completely on her own terms, and to what extent was I actually not following that advice and drawing deeply on the ways in which my mother's sensibilities are sort of continuous within my life. So that to me, so I'd be curious what Stella makes of that sort of continuity. I think Stella Adler is also, well, let me save that thought. Norman Rabin, I'm terrified to know what Rabin would think. Because Rabin was known as this sort of taskmaster. He would walk around his studio, and as I mentioned in the lecture, if he didn't like something you had painted, he would just knock the canvas onto the floor. If he didn't like what you'd painted, he would just draw on his own palette and paint over what you'd done, right? So I worry that this is a very clean copy of the novel, and I worry how bruised and damaged it would be once Rabin started knocking it around.
Yeah.
But I do hope, that Rabin would see a flicker of his idea of art as a way of life, right? That's what Rabin is trying to teach, that you can only write something worthwhile by drawing deeply on your own emotion and experience. And this is where he's most at odds with Adler, right? And part of his storyline with Dylan is sort of about this, that, Rabin is one of the only artists that Dylan has ever publicly credited with influencing. Well, he's one of the only artists who is still alive when he was credited in that way. And Dylan said of Rabin that he took my hand and my eye and he taught me how to see again. And Rabin was obsessed with this idea of sight. And Dylan would talk in this period about how he had been blind for years. He had been blind since he wrote Blonde on Blonde. And what Rabin was trying to teach him was that Dylan couldn't just resurrect these earlier aesthetic modalities of his work from a decade ago, that he was no longer that artist. He had to relinquish his attachment to the person he had been, and he had to write more deeply from what he was going through in that moment of his life, which meant writing about things that he didn't want to write about. It meant writing about his divorce. It meant writing about his feeling that he hadn't produced anything worthwhile in a decade. And that's why Blood on the Tracks is such a raw, personal album. But for Rabin, that's what any worthwhile work of art requires, that rawness and intensity. And so I hope that he would see a flicker of that reflected here. And I think that Evan is going through a similar process. And so who does that leave? June, who of course is a character drawn from my mother. And, as I was saying before, one of the realizations that Evan is coming to is that his writing can't just be sort of purely cerebral, that it has to have this moral or spiritual dimension. So, of course, I would hope that she would feel that reflected in the work. And Evan, Evan's not thinking about this novel anymore. He's trying to write his second novel.
Okay. Yeah. I think what attracted me so much to the characters of Stella Adler and Norman Rabin in the book is that, they're representatives of this old world.
Yes.
And they're steeped in that milieu. One of the things that's striking about this book, and especially about the sections in which Evan describes his boyhood and his experience taking care of his mother as she's dying of cancer, is that, this is a Jewish story that's taken away from, or that's not placed within a distinctly Jewish milieu. And so my question is it really possible to write Jewish fiction that is isolated from that type of milieu? And is it possible to write Jewish fiction at a time in which so many of the major sociological questions that have motivated Jewish literature in the past seem to be resolved? Big emphasis on the word seem, regardless. So, for instance, when people talk about Jewish fiction, usually they use the framework of, assimilation to understand it. Or in, contexts that are less politically accepting, they talk about political inclusion. So what does it mean to write Jewish fiction at a time in which those questions have been resolved? There's a couple moments in the book in which Evan remarks or talks about the success that Jews have had in America. I remember at one point he thinks to himself about the Jewish donors that have endowed parts of the hospital, and he says to himself something like, are they trying to prove that they're the model minority? Are they trying to prove that they're a minority at all? Are those the types of questions that you think could generate new Jewish literature?
No.
No, okay.
But let me explain. So that's an interesting moment. Let's work backwards. So Evan's in the hospital and he sees this plaque, right? And what he's going through at that moment is he's not reflecting on the sort of success of assimilation in America. He's reflecting on the success in urban America. And he's reflecting on when he was a teenager, he never wanted other people to know that he was Jewish, right? Because he's badly bullied for this. And he's sort of almost jarred to see this plaque, right? And the sort of pride and openness of this. And he has, as you described, this sort of ambivalent response to this. Or what is this about? Is this about demonstrating we belong so casually that we'll put our names there? Or we need to belong, so there are names, right? But I think that's one moment in the novel, maybe one of the few that really deals with this question of assimilation in the present day. I think what you describe about assimilation, part of what I'm trying to get at in the book and also the lecture is what are the actual possibilities that are opened up by Jewish literature when the focus no longer has to be sociological? Like, I don't see much Torah in Philip Roth. Do you? I mean, I think it's fascinating that through so much of the 20th century, the notion of Jewish literature basically becomes social, right? It's writers who often beautifully and movingly are writing about what it means to be an outsider or an immigrant or generational tensions. But these are sociologically Jewish questions just kind of by historical accident.
Yeah.
Right? That Jews ended up in America in the 20th century. And so, like any immigrant group, right, there's actually nothing specifically Jewish about this. You could find the same questions that are approached in Chinese American literature, or I'd pick your immigrant community. One of the privileges of assimilation is that you then get to ask these more foundational questions. Right? Then you get to write a novel about Jewish mysticism. Then you get to write a novel that asks, what does it mean to draw on Torah literature to describe my relationship with my mother, right? Yeah. And that to me, I mean, again, just speaking personally, that's sort of a more enticing project than writing about the ways in which American Jews are sort of belong or don't belong, or those. I think there actually are a lot of tensions there. But I wonder to what extent those are really philosophically Jewish questions, or they're just a particular variation on a universal theme.
Yeah. I mean, we could get into what's particular, what's universal. To a certain extent, I mean, it's universal in the American context, in that there are so many different groups that have come to this country and have attempted to be included, attempted to find their place. I would say that it's also a very much Jewish story, in that Jews throughout the diaspora have had similar experiences. What makes American Jewry so unique, or at least what people tend to isolate as that which makes American Jewry unique, is the level to which that process has been, quote unquote, successful. But I want to go back to what you said about the Torah, which is one of the main intertexts that you use in this book. You say at one point that the Torah had a couple of good observations, or at least Evan says that the Torah had a couple of good observations. And there are various things that we can discuss. I think the most striking use of the Torah in this book comes in the last 7 chapters, when you describe the last week of June's life. So if you could just speak about that, speak about some of the artistic choices you made there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just say I'll say one more thing about assimilation, because I fear I've presented myself as more disinterested in this question than I am. It's about the way it's approached. So I think Norman Rabin and Stella Adler are really having an argument not just about art, but also about assimilation, right? Their aesthetic differences parallel their differences in how they think Jews should approach assimilation in 20th century America. So Adler's whole approach is forget your identity, learn the role, right? And she speaks with this clipped, sort of fake transatlantic accent. She changes her name at some point to sound less Jewish. She goes to Hollywood, it doesn't work. She grew up in the Yiddish theater. Her father was Joseph Adler, one of the iconic Yiddish actors. And at a certain point, she says to June, June is going to an audition, and Adler says, straighten your hair. You're auditioning for the American theater, not the Yiddish theater, right? So her theory of art, which is embody the role, forget yourself, completely parallels her theory of assimilation, right? Norman Rabin, whose theory of art is draw as deeply as you can on yourself, on what's inside you. And he speaks in this heavy Yiddish accent. He speaks in Russian, he speaks in Ukrainian. He walks around his studio talking about his father, Shalom Aleichem, talking about, he's talking about all the 19th century Yiddish writers. And he's completely proud to inhabit this identity, right? And he's also a New Yorker. He's lived in New York at this point for 60 years, right? But that to me is that's one approach of sort of how do you think about this relationship between art and assimilation. I mean, when you think of a writer like Roth, right? Roth hated being described as a Jewish writer, right? Roth, one of the many ironies of Roth's body of work is that for him, literature was a way of carrying himself into America, right? It was a way of moving beyond the parochialism of Jewish Newark, right? But he also famously said if he ever wrote a Civil War novel, it would start, the year was 1861 in Newark, New Jersey, right? So he was trapped. He couldn't write himself beyond what he knew, but he wanted to, right? Anyway, that's one more thought on assimilation. So what happens in the last 7 chapters is June and Evan are in the hospital, and Evan, who has not realized until this moment that that his mother's life is ending, is beginning to slowly observe and sort of describe every last moment that they're experiencing together. And he realizes that he's entering this sort of liminal space where, her life is ending, he's never going to be the same. And it takes place over 7 days. And I map this onto the 7 days of creation in Genesis. And so on the first day, it's small things, right? The day that God creates vegetation, Evan realizes that his mother, who loves nature, who's raised him in this landscape in the woods, he realizes that there's no reason that she should have seen nature for the last time. And he goes out and he finds this small plant and he brings it back to her, and she's inhaling the smell of the plant. And sort of his relationship with the end of her life is entirely mediated by this sort of Torah narrative, right? Of these days of this sort of creation of something new. And I think, we're also seeing a version of this young man that's sort of ending and being reborn, right? And I wanted a metaphor for that. And it's interesting that you observed it, because I think very few people have. Because it's small. It's just these sort of minor incidents here, or the first day, the day it's the second day when there's light, right? And he realizes that they're in this hospital room with no light, right? And he's beginning to realize that they're going to be there for a few days, right? So he sort of figures out how to get her to a room with light. And this just makes all the difference for her. The last days of her life, she's going to be in sunlight rather than in darkness, right? And that's the way that the metaphor runs through the last 7 chapters. And for me, right, as you say, that's an example of sort of drawing some element of the sort of, this in a very particular way, but drawing the sort of literature, metaphor, understanding of what does it mean to create a world, right? What does it mean to lose a world and recreate a world? That's what he's going through.
Yeah. I thought it was a very creative and interesting use of the Genesis story. Firstly, because it's contrasted in that moment in a scene in which you encounter a Chabad rabbi, or in which Evan encounters a Chabad rabbi in the hospital, and kind of rejects his attempt to perform last rites in a Jewish way. So what I read in that scene is that this is the character trying to formulate his own Judaism using religious texts, but in a way which goes against, the traditional religious understanding of how those texts should be read, how they should be applied to life. What also struck me about this particular moment in the novel is that you deal with the issue of assisted suicide. I don't want to speak for the entirety of the Jewish tradition, but there are traditionally in Judaism, assisted suicide is very much a taboo. And so to combine that with the Jewish with the biblical narrative of creation, I found to be very compelling, and it definitely brought up a lot of questions for me as I was finishing the book.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for reading this, this aspect of it so deeply. Well, the encounter with the rabbi sort of fixes some of these questions. This Chabad rabbi comes into this private room in the hospital, doesn't knock, and just says, June is dying, and he says, is she Jewish, right? And what Evan resists is a sort of official categorization, or this notion that the rabbi possesses a sort of exclusive authority to perceive or mark her as Jewish and to sort of appear on his own terms. And his question is not sort of, does she want Jewish last rites? His question presumes that, is she Jewish, right? And Evan's response, it sort of becomes a moment where Evan is articulating his own notion of Jewish identity, which is a highly literary one, right? And he's saying, he says to the rabbi, or I think he just thinks it, because he's polite. He thinks Judaism is a story and you stopped reading long ago, right? And he resists this notion that this is a Chabad rabbi, that there's a sort of, he enters, right, with this authority that comes because, right, he's pure blood Jewish, or because he's observant, he's kosher, these sorts of things, and that June sort of needs him to affirm her Judaism, right? And Evan feels strongly that she doesn't, right? That she doesn't need him to make her a Jew, but he also, I think he resists that this isn't a question. He resists that it's sort of assumed, right? But this is also the moment where Evan is refashioning and really coming to understand the terms of his own Jewish identity, right? And there's one moment in that encounter where Evan thinks to himself, this man wants to pray, but he doesn't know my mother, right? So how, and he wants to say the same prayer that he's going to say with the next person, right? And he thinks of this line, it's the Baal Shem Tov again, right? Where, what's the exact line? That it's, that it's something along the lines of, that the 1,000 preordained prayers are not worth one open heart, right? So those questions are sort of coming to fruition in that encounter, right? Well.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you pull so much on the rural setting of this book. And when you think of Jewish literature, you don't really think of anything that's rural. I mean, the general ethos behind Hasidism definitely encourages a certain connection with nature.
Yes.
But when you think of Jewish literature, it's mainly urban. There's a famous scene in one of Isaac Babel's stories in which, he's trying to become a writer, and he doesn't know how, and someone gives him the advice that, to be a true writer, you have to be able to name the plants around you and the flora and the fauna. And this is an idea that's repeated, that, in a lot of traditions, I'm speaking mainly about the Russian Jewish tradition, the thing that prevents Jews from assimilating into the literary world is a lack of connection with nature, which the gentry, who essentially created Russian literature, that they literally owned nature, and therefore had a knowledge of it that Jews didn't have. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about some of the opportunities the setting opened up for you and some of maybe the challenges that it presented. The only other piece of Jewish literature that comes to mind which really deals with the rural experience is Tevye. Because Tevye is not a shtetl Jew, he's not an urban Jew, he's a rural Jew. And his milieu is his family and Shalom Aleichem, or the person who he talks to throughout the stories. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Tevye makes his appearance in the novel as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing this up because it helps me clarify something in the previous question, which is I think there have been readers who look at that rabbi scene and think, oh, this is just, there's this sort of vitriol for Hasidic Jews. But it's actually the complete opposite. I think this book has a great reference for Hasidism, right? But it's trying to draw out what I would describe, what June would describe as sort of the neo-Hasidic ideas that have been lost in a contemporary sort of culture of the preordained, right? But it's what I was describing earlier, this notion that Martin Buber thinks of himself as more Hasidic than the Hasidim, right? And then there's the point about Lucy as well, right? I mean, June has an extraordinarily sort of neo-Hasidic life, right? Where she feels, she lives in this rural area of the Hudson Valley and, the section I read with the trees, she has this deep religious feeling for nature. And I think what you're describing in a way, it brings us back to this question of sort of what is a Jewish novel. I mean, there's nothing Jewish about urban life, right? In a philosophical or theological sense, it's just a sociological accident, right? And then of course that has in turn shaped elements of Jewish culture, right? But I think for me, setting it in this landscape is a way to draw out these ideas of sort of the religiosity and nature, but it's also my sort of challenge to what we think of as the Jewish novel, right? Which is suburban or urban. And I think that there sort of doesn't have to be a reason for that. I mean, there are plenty of Jews who live in rural America, right? And I think, but that experience is not canonical. Right? It sits outside of what is perceived as the sort of dominant story. Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about the book has to do with the issue of language and the issue of voice. In my view, so much of what makes Jewish literature Jewish is that it actively engages in this question of language. And of course, there's a long history of how secular literature began to be written in Jewish languages like Hebrew and Yiddish. There are all types of ideological bridges that had to be built to allow that to happen, questions to be resolved. But even in, the hyphenated Jewish literatures, whether we're talking about Russian Jewish literature or American Jewish literature, readers oftentimes get the sense that certain characters, maybe they're speaking in English, but really they're speaking in Yiddish. And 9 times out of 10, that's the language, that kind of imparts its characteristics upon people's speech. What's interesting to me about this book is that is not central to how the narrator and other characters formulate their voice. And so I guess I'm wondering whether that was something you dealt with in the writing process. How did you decide to give the voices you end up giving to your characters? And whether you think, I mean, this kind of goes with the grain of your other answers, whether you think this is actually something inherent to Jewish literature, this kind of preoccupation with language.
Well, I mean, certainly to a certain strand of Jewish literature, of course. There's a great line from Amos Oz where he says, you know, the people I feel most sorry for are American Jews who think they know something about Jewish literature because they can't, you know, they can't read the most exciting things that are happening, which in his view were in Hebrew literature. But I mean, that's a fascinating thing for Oz to say, because if you look at, you know, something like A Tale of Love and Darkness, it's riddled with these biblical references that go well beyond what was happening in his generation with modern Hebrew, right? So I guess I'm just sort of pluralistic about these things. I think it's wonderful the way that a writer like Henry Roth weaves through Yiddish and English, and you know, these scenes in Call It Sleep where these children who grew up in Yiddish-speaking homes and are the first people in their family to learn English in America are sort of speaking to each other half in English and half in Yiddish, and you almost can't decipher it, but it's Joycean, it's extraordinary. But you know, for me, I think the question is more, it's sort of about, almost more about accent or voice than language, right? All of these people are speaking English, but they're speaking it in really different ways, right? Rabin is speaking, right, with this, he's never lost this Ukrainian accent, although he's been in New York, right, 60 years, and right. But Adler has, right? Adler has made a very conscious choice to lose the Yiddish references and accent that she would have grown up speaking, right? And you know, but what can I say except that it's an English language novel?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess my last question before we throw it to the audience has to do with sexuality in the book, gender and sexuality in the book. You know, when we think of American Jewish literature and specifically of authors like Philip Roth, you know, we have this conception of Jewish literature that is centrally focused on problems of male sexuality. And there are various interpretations of that. People have suggested that the frustration that Jewish American male characters feel is a sublimation of the frustrations they feel with regards to their own assimilation into American society. And this book is not centrally focused around male sexuality. In fact, it's focused around the experience of June, and you know, her story as a survivor of, you know, pretty reprehensible acts. And so, is that something you thought about as you were writing? And yeah, if you could just comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's certainly unfortunate that so much, 20th century American literature, but also American Jewish literature, is sort of, centered on establishing the male prowess of the writer through, sort of sexually aggressive lifestyles or ways of being. And I think that's, that's a great sort of moral, spiritual, artistic detriment of that work, right? And there's another side of that, right? The other side of that is women who had to experience those men, right? And I'm not one of those women, but my mother certainly was, and I wanted to write about her experiences, and that it comes out in a few ways through the book. One of them is what you're describing, that she's a victim of sexual violence, and in a very artistic context, right? In a context in which she seeks out an older writer and asks for, and admires this writer and asks for feedback on her work, and he sort of, decides to, make a pass at her, much more than a pass, but decides to sort of sexualize the encounter in a way that's not consensual. And then the second way that it comes out is, this thread is I guess, a bit more to do with sort of love and art and less sexual violence. But, she realizes at a certain point her relationship with Dylan, for him, love is never going to be as significant as his music, right? They have this parting of the ways because for him, he really lives by what Rabin says, art as a way of life, right? And after he's finished Blood and she's finished playing Hedda, she sort of has this hope that they'll have quieter time, and she just realizes, no, I mean, he's on to the next woman, he's on to the next album, this is how he's lived his life, and that's not how she wants to live. She's pursuing something higher. So, yeah, I think that writing those elements into the book, it's not like I set out to, take on these naughty 20th century American Jewish novelists, but I think it came sort of organically from the way in which I inherited or learned about that set of life experiences.
Yeah. Thank you for all your answers. I found them all very fascinating, and if there are questions in the audience.
Yeah, thank you. This was one of the best chats I've had about the book. I mean, really, thank you for reading so deeply and thoroughly, and it's fantastic. Thank you, Misha.
Questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk and a really wonderful book.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question about what you were saying earlier on about imaginative Judaism free from the calcified forms of Jewish life and Jewish religiosity, which sounds a lot like Christ.
I also noticed that. I didn't want to accuse you of anything, but
no.
Christ is not a bad thing.
no, it isn't.
I certainly never thought in those terms. I think, to me, that's maybe less kind of theological revolution in a Christian sense, and more a question of, right, the fascinating thing about Judaism, or about any sort of form of belief that maps itself onto social institutions, is that these two things then exist in what appears to be one plane, but they're actually two completely different planes, right? One is sort of what it means to be Jewish in an institutional context, where the questions are not philosophical or theological, they are social or practical. It's not that none of the questions are, but it's that life gets organized in a certain way, right? There are certain assumptions that are built into how that form of Judaism is organized or expressed, right? And then there's a question of sort of what is this set of ideas apart from the ways in which it's expressed institutionally. And I think because I'm someone who didn't grow up in that institutional Jewish world, but have had my own cultural, spiritual, artistic connections or deep connections to Judaism. That's a question that I'm always asking, right? Of sort of what is Judaism outside officialdom?
Yeah, I think one way of, if I could just
Please.
add on to your answer, or ever, put it in the terms that I was thinking about it. I think one way of looking at it is that there are all these things in the Jewish canon and Jewish knowledge and the Jewish tradition that you can draw on. There are these, various antipodes that are constantly in tension, and one of the main antipodes is that between calcified tradition, institutional life, and an individual's personal connection to God, the desire to seek justice, even if seeking justice means going against various calcified forms, calcified institutions. And so, and of course, these are critiques that Jesus makes as a Jewish figure, but they exist within the Jewish tradition as well. And I saw you as kind of tapping into that, into kind of a alternative Jewish lineage that doesn't necessarily run through the rabbis and the Kehillah, but that runs through people like the Baal Shem Tov and people like the biblical prophets that have their own critiques.
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, first, it's spectacular. It only took me 6 months on book tour to be accused of sparking Christian revolution. So that's fun. But no, in all seriousness, I think I'm trying to situate that set of ideas much more in either a pre-rabbinic framework or in the intellectual tradition of people like the Baal Shem Tov or Buber, or there are others who run through the book who are picking up on this set of ideas. So that's one way of putting it. But I think there's also a parallel here to artists who are asking the question, what does it mean to find divinity in art when you no longer have religious faith, right? I think, when you think of people like Leonard Cohen would be a fantastic example of this, right? Because Cohen, he grows up deeply within Jewish community and faith, right? Marc Chagall is another excellent example of them. Both of them grow up in deeply observant homes, and then they lose religious faith in their lives, right? Just they don't believe, right? They have deeply secular lives. But each of them express a divinity through their artwork, right? Chagall has this line where he says, he says, "My paintings are my prayers." Right? It's not a cliche to Chagall. Right? His parents were Hasidic Jews, right? To say that his paintings are his prayers is an extraordinary thing to say. You listen to you listen to the last album of Leonard Cohen, right? You listen to a song like "You Want It Darker," right? And the intensity of that music could only come from someone who needs a place to put this feeling of divinity, and it can't be in prayer, right? And I think Leonard Cohen and Marc Chagall are much more influential on me than Jesus Christ.
Yes.
It's a fantastic conversation, so many things that one could comment on. So I was thinking about Bob Dylan as an American Jewish novelist for a moment. Right? I mean, I see he won the Nobel Prize for novelists, and thinking about him in connection with Stella Adler. And this idea that Dylan was, constantly shape-shifting. Constantly, it's almost like he only existed in transformation from one novel to the next, right? This love affair with the road. This early, I can't remember the exact lyric now, but early album where he said, learned her task ask and learn it well, or people, I don't know if anyone remembers it exactly.
Yeah, that's, it'll come to one of those songs.
Free will.
Free will, yeah, that sounds right, yeah.
So it's this idea of like, learn your role,
Yeah.
learn it well. So I had never thought about Dylan that way.
Know your song before you start singing.
Yes. Yes. So does that mean it's preordained? Does that mean you improvise? Like, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So, but I was curious in terms of like the genre piece, right? Like the autofiction. You said something really interesting at the beginning. You said, or maybe Evan said, I can't remember, that's maybe part of the question. You never know how to tell my own story, not even to myself.
Oh.
So there's something about the freedom of autofiction, right? Where you can stand outside of yourself and see yourself. And Roth, obviously, and Zuckerman, right? And Roth said about Zuckerman, and I can to the end of all my comments and ask the question. Roth said about Zuckerman that Zuckerman, he created awakened his own intelligence. So I'm wondering about like, what the autofictional impulse allowed you to do with this book, and also what you may have learned from Evan.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. What is the autofiction? I think that in part the autofiction let me go into the terrain that we're talking about. You know, if you write a memoir, no one's really interested in biblical metaphor, right? Like what would that last section we were talking about where the final 7 days in the hospital are related through the metaphors of Genesis. What does that look like in a memoir, right? I think that for me, writing a novel is a way for me to say that I actually don't subscribe to this ideology that says our lives are objectively available to us and we just need to write them down. That's sort of the fiction at the center of a memoir, right? I lived my life so I know it, so I'm going to tell it to you. No, if you have a much more mystical view of life, that the essential things are sort of always just beyond our grasp, that we're all living somewhere between fact and fiction, right? That the most interesting things in life are in that gulf: memory, experience, perspective. None of those things are true or untrue, fiction or nonfiction, right? They're all somewhere in between, right? They're interpretation, right? And I think that would be very hard to explain or make use of that aesthetic perspective in a memoir. It's not what a memoir is, it's not what it's read for. So I think writing a novel let me be very clear about that's what I'm doing. That's how I understand my own life. That's how I understand what we're doing when we talk about our lives. And certainly what we're doing when we turn our lives into any form of art. And I'll just add as an addendum that I'm completely fascinated by what happens there's something that happens when you write words down in a book that's different than any other art form, and it provokes this question, is it fiction or nonfiction? But no one ever asks this question about music, painting, theater, right? But all of those art forms exist somewhere between fiction and nonfiction. I mean, what is blood on the tracks, right? There's a lot of experience in that, right? I mean, what is acting if not, sorry Stella Adler, but if not drawing on your own experience, right, to tell story, right? So all of these forms exist between fiction and nonfiction, but there's something about the novel when you write the words down. Right? People wonder about this. They have an urge to classify it. Is it nonfiction or fiction? I'll just say one more thing. What a strange term, nonfiction. I'm completely fascinated by this term because I think it sort of reveals its own limitations in the term, right? It doesn't even have an identity except as a negation. It's not fiction. But if you called it, if you walked into a bookstore and instead of a nonfiction section, there was like a truth, section, a reality section. We would all be extraordinarily skeptical of this, right? So what is that genre? I've never figured it out. And every memoirist I know admits to compositions and fictions.
Yeah, just carrying on that chain of thought, and also in terms of some of the aesthetic forefathers of this novel. This conversation makes me think of Zabel's Rings of Saturn, which starts in a hospital. This novel ends in a hospital. And there's also a novel, or one of these books that is in that valley between fact and fiction.
No.
And as you read it, though, that question becomes less and less essential to the point that it becomes irrelevant to the aesthetic impact. That book, and Boy from the North Country is a novel of love, so it's also about loss. And Rings of Saturn is also about loss in less direct ways, perhaps. And both this novel and I think Zabel, right, have a kind of mania to them, particularly towards the end of Boy, when it's those 7 days in the hospital, kind of claustrophobia, just mounting and mounting. That Zabel also creates on the plains of East Anglia. There's a sense of oppression of the environment. I'd love to hear just the way that Zabel or other writers in this mode shape, particularly that final third of the novel.
Thank you for such a wonderful question. And there's a great story about Rings of Saturn, which is before it came out, Zabel says to his publisher, I want this classified as fiction and travelogue. Right? The publisher just says to him, like, well, we can't do that. Zabel's, why? It's both, right? And obviously, Zabel's right. And I think that something that gives Zabel's prose its power is the way that he perceives the surreal in the ordinary, right? That he's walking this landscape and he sees beyond the sort of literal observations that he's making. If it's on the landscape, he sees its history, the violence that has structured it, right? I mean, Zabel is someone who never just sees fact or fiction, right? He's taking us deeper and deeper into his own sort of surreal subjectivity, right? And I think that final third of the novel that you're describing, that's sort of Evan's experience in the hospital, right? Where everything he knows is being reworked and sort of his whole sort of vantage point on what life is, what mortality is, what love is, right? All of these questions are being transformed by the landscape of the hospital, right? I think Zabel is, there's a section, there's a part of the book where Evan is reading Proust and he's so taken by Proust and he's 20 and he wants to learn to write this way, and he says, I will be satisfied if I learn to write just one sentence of Proustian language, which is the only way to relate to Proust as a role model without going crazy. And I think the same would be said of Zabel, right? You can't write like him, right? I mean, even Zabel can't write like Zabel.
Questions? All right, I have one last question.
Oh gosh, okay.
And then I'll, let you free.
Yeah.
This book is really packed with authors, textual references, and I said to myself, I have to pick at least one of them to read or reread before this discussion. And so the one I picked was Hedda Gabler.
Okay, great.
Which is really, one of the central texts that you deal with. Yeah. I was watching it this morning, And I mean, part of Hedda's sickness is that she wants her lover to die beautifully.
Yeah.
And it's revealed to her that he doesn't die beautifully.
No.
He doesn't shoot himself
No.
in the heart. He accidentally shoots himself in the bowels. And so, in a way, that's a comment or a critique of a very romanticized understanding of death and suicide. And I was wondering how your book relates to that kind of tension between death that is beautiful and a death that is not beautiful.
That's a wonderful question. There's a moment when Evan is in the hospital and he realizes he's trying to sort of make everything perfect for the end of June's life. He's trying to narrativize the end of her life. And he realizes, he says, the illusion of a poetic death is for the living, not the dying, right? That actually what matters for June is that she's in enormous pain. She's lived her life with great integrity and purpose. And now it's coming to its end. And there's actually no aestheticization of the end of her life that will be meaningful to him or to her, and that will even really make it easier for him, right? And that's sort of the illusion of, the final deathbed words or, the spectacular death in Hedda. And, he's realizing in that moment that, that for her sort of what has mattered is what has already happened between them. He's sort of holding on at some point for a final word, and then he's realizing, she has said to me, she has given me everything she has to give. That's what it has meant for her to love him as a mother to a son. And that's his role now, is to understand more deeply what those gifts have been, but there's sort of no final poem. There's no moment, right? And in Hedda, I think, part of what Ibsen is getting at is that Hedda wants this escape from her life, right? And suicide, a spectacular death, it sort of offers itself as almost a religious illusion, right? That, this beautiful death will sort of, elevate this forbidden romance, right? This love that's never going to be. Of course, that's not actually what's going to happen if they kill themselves, right? So were you watching you said you were watching it, the Glenda Jackson version from '75, or this version that was just put out? There was this new adaptation last year, which had
Ingrid Bergman.
Okay, okay, it's the only one, okay. The Glenda Jackson's also good. The one that came out last year is so bad because it makes the same mistake that every adaptation of Fitzgerald makes, which is that these works are critiques of people who are sort of superficially obsessed with, the aesthetics of wealth. And then these films just reproduce those aesthetics, but unironically.
Yeah.
Doing a bad Hedda, there should be some statute against that.
All right. Well, let's give Sam a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.